The Tariff Impact is a video podcast series that helps Ontario manufacturers navigate challenges and opportunities. It is brought to you by a partnership between the Trillium Network for Advanced Manufacturing and York Link, part of York Region Economic Development.
Todd, welcome. Thanks for taking the time out of what's probably a very busy and dynamic schedule to be with us today.
It's a pleasure, Brendan. Happy to be here and to be on your podcast and chat about, I think, the topic that is on the top of everybody's mind.
For those who are not familiar with EDC, hoping we can begin the conversation with a bit of an overview of what Export Development Canada is and how you can help Canadians, companies in their exporting journey as Canada's export credit agency. What products and what services do you offer normally?
Right. Yeah, so Export Development Canada, as you say, Brendan, is the official export credit agency of Canada. We were actually created a little bit over 80 years ago, coming out of the Second World War, along with a number of other countries' export credit agencies, really to try and help the global economy, find its footing and stabilize after the Second World War. And I start way back in history because I think it's useful to note that EDC was really born of crisis and designed to step up and help the Canadian economy and Canadian companies in times of crisis. And so while it's unfortunate they happen, they sure do happen. And we've had, a significant amount of previous experience with previous tariff regimes, in the pandemic, the global financial crisis back in 2007 and 2008. Really, EDC is here to step in and to fill gaps when the private market pulls back. That's often in a crisis. And we can do that through a variety of different ways, to your question. And, I like to think of our product suite as kind of being the best of a bank, an insurance company, an investment firm, and an advisory company all put together. And what I mean by that is we start all the way at the beginning of an exporter's journey, or at the beginning of a business plan in some cases, with market intelligence and information that can be provided to companies, who are looking to maybe diversify markets, who are looking to put together maybe their first exporting plan in some cases, all the way through a suite of financial products. And so that could be things like credits insurance that help, an exporter guard against non-payment by a foreign buyer, through to a suite of lending products. We can lend both directly to a Canadian company as well as to an international buyer of a Canadian company's goods or services, to help them kind of generate a little bit more cash flow and working capital fluidity and liquidity, all the way through to our equity program, which can invest either alongside other Canadian investors or even directly on our own to help companies, in emerging industries kind of get off the ground. So really like a wide suite of products that are, all designed to meet customer needs. And we would, in an average year, service between 25 and 30,000 Canadian companies in over 150 markets around the world. And to give you an idea, last year, we supported about $125 billion in Canadian exports. So fairly significant, and over our history, well above $1 trillion in Canadian exports supported. So we're pretty broad based, but we like to think we really focus in on customer needs.
Yeah, well, and certainly you would have members of the EDC team across the world with deep and intimate knowledge of the jurisdictions in which they operate, correct?
Yeah, exactly right. And that's one of the fun things I get to do in my job is to oversee the international markets team here at EDC. And you're right, by May of this year, we will have 26 international representations around the globe, kind of across three north to south pillars is how we think of them here at EDC. So America's, Canada down to Chile, and then Europe, Middle East, and Africa as a secondary pillar, with a number of representations in Europe as well as in the Middle East, Johannesburg in South Africa, for example. And then in Asia or in the Indo-Pacific, where we've spent a lot of time and energy over the course of the last couple of years really developing those markets. And as I say, we'll open our 12th representation in Asia, in Bangkok, in Thailand, in May. And so a fairly significant international footprint where we can really help extract that market information and intelligence, share it back with Canadian companies who are looking at exploring those markets, but also really be able to help make some connections as well. So when a Canadian company is looking for, what's that buyer look like for me, for example, in Indonesia or in South Korea, with our team on the ground, we can help make those introductions and connections, which is also usually very valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. Canadian exporters are facing a difficult moment, facing uncertainty from tariff threats, and this has posed particular challenges for companies that do business in the United States. How is EDC responding to this challenge? And what new programs or services are you offering to the business and the exporting and the hopeful exporting community in light of some of the challenges that we've been facing over the past weeks and months?
Yeah, it's certainly been a very challenging start to 2025. I think everyone would agree. And, we did spend a lot of time, even starting in November last year, Brendan, right after the election in the U.S., engaging with our customer base, reaching out to stakeholders, chambers of commerce, industry associations, again, to really better understand the level of concern within our client base, and then try to develop programming that would help address some of those needs and some of those challenges that were being put on the table. And it is significant. I mean, I think we just need to talk about it kind of straight up in that way. And with a country that exported last year about 77% of its goods to the United States, EDC's own, customer base would be very heavily either invested in or exporting to the United States. This is something that was very much top of mind for us. And we did want to try and get ahead of it to the extent we could. And so we developed a program at EDC, which we call the Trade Impact Program. Was just announced on the 7th of March, so just a little while ago now. And it's a $5 billion envelope of additional capacity that EDC is making available to current customers, future customers or prospects, to try and help, again, mitigate some of the risk we're seeing. And, in a way, a lot of our customers are telling us that the uncertainty is actually even sometimes worse than the tariff. And so for exporters who are in sectors or segments that maybe haven't yet been targeted by tariffs, they're still facing a lot of the same challenges, just not knowing what the future looks like. Should they invest, should they not invest? And so this program, again, tries to take a number of our different products that we have available at EDC and stretch our appetite to kind of go beyond the normal course of operation to help mitigate some of those risks. And so I mentioned a little bit earlier our accounts receivable insurance product, or credits insurance product, sometimes called, which helps kind of protect a Canadian exporter against non-payment from a buyer. And so what you might see, what's starting already, but may accelerate, is what we would call repudiation at the border. So someone's already got a contract, they go to ship it. The U.S. buyer decides, like, with the tariffs, we don't want to honor that contract. EDC has an insurance policy that we can put in place to help cover some of those potential losses for Canadian exporters. We also been talking a lot about trade diversification, and maybe we'll talk about it even a bit more later. But we are thinking about, longer term mitigation or solutions for Canadian companies might look like finally taking that, that plunge, that step to look at investing in a different market, maybe setting up a production line somewhere else or operations in a third market. EDC can help with a lending solution to allow Canadian companies to have the access to capital they need to make that investment abroad. We also have a number of kind of working capital guarantee type programs, which provide additional liquidity to companies who need it. Their operating costs might be elevated now. They're looking at sourcing different inputs from their supply chain, and it may be more expensive. And so we have a number of products that can help kind of increase their liquidity or mitigate other risks like currency fluctuations. So we have a foreign exchange guarantee, for example, that allows you to kind of fix that expected kind of currency exchange rate at the moment you sign your contract. So if the Canadian dollar, decreases, for example, against the US dollar, you've got a bit of a backstop there in place to help you make sure you know what that exchange rate is going to be when it's time to get paid. So maybe just a few examples of the different pieces that we can put in place to help Canadian companies through a pretty challenging moment.
Yeah, and I mean, it sounds quite comprehensive. As the result of the tariffs and tariff threats and combination thereof, there's been an increased focus on the need for Canadian companies and Canadian exporters to start exploring new markets, new export markets, and potentially reduce our reliance on the U.S. market, or at least grow our markets elsewhere in addition to the U.S. market. It's often easier said than done. What are your thoughts? What can you share about Canada's need or the value for Canadian companies to diversify its markets at home, globally? And where does EDC see opportunity for Canada, for Canadian companies, for Canadian exporters? And how can you help facilitate growth in diverse markets?
Yeah, great question. I think at EDC, we would say, probably for the last 30 or 40 years, we have been trying to encourage trade diversification, for the nation and for companies who are looking to export or really kind of create additional resiliency in their operating plan. It's like your own personal investments. You probably wouldn't, invest in only one asset or one asset class and expect to have, some ability to kind of weather storms. You would kind of spread it around. And I think there's a real opportunity here for Canada writ large and for many of our Canadian companies to really, I hate to say it, but not waste a crisis here, right? And to actually take the plunge. And I like the way you framed it, Brendan, maybe look at markets in addition to the United States. I think that's a really important point. No matter, I think, what happens over the coming weeks and months, the gravitational pull of the U.S., the size of that market, it's always going to be Canada's largest market. I don't think that will ever change. But there is an opportunity to, again, try and build in some resilience for us as an economy and also for a company, more specifically by looking at other markets. And so, Canada has, I think, currently about 15 active free trade agreements with over 50 different countries. Canada is the only nation in the world to have a free trade agreement with every other G7 country, as an example. And it's kind of spread right throughout the globe. So a very strong kind of regulatory trade policy underpinning, which covers, I think, roughly 2/3 of global consumers. So Canada's in a very good position from that perspective. And so when EDC looks at that, we say, well, those are good markets for companies who've maybe only exported to the US to look at first. And so do you have some complementary markets in Europe, for example, that offer opportunities for Canadian manufacturers, for example, or for Canadian, food producers? I think absolutely. And we've maybe underutilized things like the Canadian-Europe trade agreement to this point. Another big market, and I'll touch on it again, is the Indo-Pacific. And so when EDC steps back and we say, where is global demand going to be coming from over the next 5 to 10 years? It really is Asia. It will have more than half of the world's population. Its consumer class is growing, by leaps and bounds, still adding more than a Canadian population of middle class every year, right, to their buying power. And so we say Indo-Pacific has huge opportunities, and through some of the trade agreements there, easier ways forward, right, for Canadian companies to look at those kind of non-US markets, perhaps for the first time. And so we would look at markets, that are within the CPTPP, to use that kind of tough acronym, but essentially a lot of Asian markets, as well as a number of other markets. South Korea, was just down in Australia a few weeks ago. The opportunities there are very tangible with a like-minded partner for us in terms of how we do business and as a country. So lots of promise in Asia, lots of opportunity in Europe. And I would say we also shouldn't forget the markets closer to home, in a strong partner in Mexico, for example. Lots of alignment for Canadian opportunity in Chile, or in Brazil and other countries in South America. So there are a number of very, I think, appealing markets for Canadian companies, depending on your size, depending on your sector.
And I think it's important to remember within the CPTPP, Mexico is a member. So we have two free trade agreements with Mexico, the USMCA, which we anticipate will be renegotiated, and the CPTPP, something that's important to remember. And also for those interested in the electric vehicle and the battery material space, Chile is very much emerging as an important supplier to North America of battery materials, specifically those that are lithium-based.
Yeah, I fully agree, Brendan, you're right. And I think some of this is about breaking that gravitational pull, right? That's long existed with kind of a Canada-US trading relationship, which again, makes a lot of sense. But once you take a step back and you start to consider other options and you get so specific to say, for my business, where's that specific opportunity? I think Canadian companies would really see there are a number of other markets that offer promise, and there are ways to kind of, get yourself ready to take advantage of those opportunities, which isn't a short-term solution, right? So I think that's the other piece maybe I just mentioned quickly is, when you're taking, advantage of a new opportunity, you really do need to do the research, right? You need to get kind of boots on the ground, get over, explore the market, make sure you've got the right relationships in place, whether that's your buyer relationship or, customs, freight forwarders, taxation, all of the advisory support that companies need. The opportunities are real and present, but you need to make sure that you're doing your homework ahead of time and you're doing it with partners that can help you. So whether that's an EDC or a trade commissioner service from the Government of Canada, your industry association or chambers of commerce, there's lots of folks that can help you. But yeah, the front end work is really critical as you start to look at some of those new markets.
Last question, promise, because I know we've all got a busy and dynamic schedule these days. But I'm hoping to get your thoughts, Todd, on the moment we're in, and as an organization that is so close to the Canadian business community, so close to the Canadian exporting and trade community, what is your message to Canadian exporters or to potential Canadian exporters who are trying to navigate this bumpy period?
Yeah, great question. And maybe you'll get my passion here fired up a little bit, Brendan. I certainly think, again, we come back to that saying, you don't want to waste a crisis. And I think it's unfortunate that we find ourselves in the period we're in, and yet here we are, right? And so I think both for the country and for companies, there is a real opportunity to do some of what we long should have maybe done a little bit more of. And so that could be market diversification, like we just spoke about. It could also be supply chain diversification. So looking at the inputs for many of our Canadian companies, are there other sources of supply, whether they're here in Canada or maybe from other partners. So maybe it's supply from Europe or Asia, not just only export to Asia, to help with those intermediate inputs. So that work is probably something that should be done. I think there's also a real opportunity for us kind of more broadly as a nation and lots of opportunity for Canadian companies to help to look at our own trade enabling infrastructure in Canada. How do we, make sure that as a nation, we're robust and resilient enough to take advantage of some of these opportunities outside of North America, for example? And so, do we have the road, rail, port, airport system, that we really require as an independent and resilient nation? I think we need additional investment there, and EDC looks forward to playing part of a role to help do that and to enable Canadian companies to be able to take advantage of some of what's there. And maybe my last thought for you is, we look at the Canadian economy, how it's evolved and modernized over time, and Canada has what the world needs, and that's what we keep coming back to. So abundant and reliable energy. We're one of the few countries in the world that's self-sufficient in terms of food production. The rest of the world is not. So how, can we help our agricultural products, whether it's commodities or processed food and beverage, get to market? You think about critical minerals, or mining more broadly. Again, Canada has a wealth of resources that not only should we get to market, but we should figure out how to better process here, get some value add component, and then get that to market. So when we look about what country is really well positioned to meet the needs of global demand going forward, I'd be hard pressed to say there's another option more appropriate, frankly, than Canada. And it's about doing some of the work we need to do to be able to kind of really take advantage of that, allow us to kind of mitigate some of the risks and uncertainty in the current, situation, for example, with the United States, and really set the company and country up for future success.
Agreed and well said. Todd, thank you so much for your time today and for coming on this series of our podcast.
It's a pleasure. Thanks so much, Brendan.
This series is produced by Storied Places Media.